Hi, this is Swan from Swan Amity Studios, and today we're looking at preparing our arcs for the Gear Up pattern. I'm going to start with my scissors that I really like for cutting paper with, and I'm going to just cut out the top portion of my traced pattern. Now, I use the freezer paper starch method, so my template has been traced onto freezer paper. You can see there. And I'm on the flat side of the freezer paper. You can see not the shiny side. I've also cut out my template so that I have a 1/2 inch on the bottom of the template. So I have that straight line that's going to line up with the seam of my block. And I've left myself extra room, a 1/2 inch instead of a 1/4 inch. Let's see why in just a moment. We're going to go ahead and start just by cutting out just the top arc. And you'll remember that I try to keep my scissors fairly straight and turn my paper instead of my scissors. That's going to give me a cleaner, more accurate cut, and it's going to keep my shoulder in line with my body so that we're doing less damage to ourselves over time. Always a positive element. I cut slowly because accuracy is important to me, and I would rather not have to cut twice. So, slowly, cut once. And we're going to take a look at what we do next. For Gear Up, we're using a bicycle pattern, which of course is what led me to make the bicycle themed Gear Up. And I'm going to take my template, my freezer paper piece, and position it. Remember, we have lots of extra room here on the bottom, so I'm going to position it on my strip so I have plenty of seam allowance on the top to turn over, and next to none here at the bottom because I know I'm going to trim away from that later anyway. I am using my new Aliso Mini. I absolutely am thrilled with this beauty. This is the M3 Pro Project Iron. And oh, look at it. It actually comes with a headlight. That's really fun. And I'm going to go ahead and just, on a high heat, iron my freezer paper into place. Once my freezer paper is in place, I'm going to use my micro serrated scissors. These are my favorite ones. I like a micro serration. I think there's a lot of great companies that produce them. This one is the Appliquick version. I like the length of the scissors. I really like the handle of the scissors. But any micro serration will allow you to get around a curve easily and comfortably with pretty good accuracy. Now I'm cutting out with a fairly generous 1/4 inch. In fact, I would say that that is more like 3/8 of an inch. But since I'm going to be using that freezer paper starch method, and I'm going to be turning over my piece using my trolley needle, I want to make sure that I am utilizing a thicker line of fabric so that I don't have to struggle with that at all. And now we're just going to take a look at getting our starch on and getting ready to turn over our piece. We're going to start with a starch solution, and I like to utilize a starch that is liquid when we start. I'm going to turn my piece this way. I'm a little more comfortable with that. And if you've watched some of my other videos, you know that I use Stayflow primarily. It's easier to get a hold of than some other liquid starches, and it comes a little thicker than I need it to be, so I can thin to what I prefer. And everyone likes that process a little differently. I use approximately 2 parts water to 1 part starch. But if you're just starting out with a freezer paper starch method, you might even want to start with a 1-to-1 solution and see if that works for you. Now, everybody is just a little bit different, so it doesn't matter what works best for someone else. It matters what works best for you. Now, we're going to leave this sitting for just a moment because whenever you're working with a starch, it is very likely that your iron will stick to the surface of your project just a little bit if you work with it when it is super damp. So we're going to let that sit for just a second. And while we do, we're going to take a look at the fact that we have also set up our block. And in advance, I've gone ahead and marked my centering lines. So just like we saw in the pattern, we wanted to make sure that we have a vertical centering mark and a horizontal centering mark. Those two markings are going to help us situate our circles in the center of the block, and our half circles in some of the blocks are going to be situated at the top and the bottom of the block. Now the goal here is to make sure that everything really does sit in the middle, so that when you do create your gear up pattern, you're more likely to come up with something that really does look a little like wheels. And we'll look at a completed block here in just a moment. Now that should have given us just enough time to go ahead and come back to our piece and turn it over. I'm going to use my trolley needle, which I have sized to my finger comfortably. Remember, you're wearing it with the kind of banjo pick side on the inside of your finger. And we're going to start, I always start on my dominant side. So right side if you are a righty like me, left side if you are a lefty. Take my starch out of the way so we don't run into anything there. And we're going to start by using our trolley needle to just pull over the edge a little bit. See how that keeps your finger out of the way of a hot iron? And then we're going to bring our very hot iron in and begin pulling towards us. We never want to just set the iron flat down. If you've seen some of my other tutorials, you know that's true. And we're just going to circle the iron towards. We're going to move the trolley needle out in advance of our curve. And when we start to get totally out in front of our body like that, we're going to turn our piece so that we stay in line with our own posture. Trolley needle ahead of the iron circles in towards the edge. That's giving us a nice, smooth curve all the way through. Beautiful. And I like to just flip my piece over as I finish up and give it a little press from the top. We're all done with our iron. We're going to set that aside for a moment. And let's go ahead and take a look at how we trim our piece, because remember, we've left extra seam allowance, and how we're going to position those things when we're done. So here we go. Let's move our iron out of our way and go to the cutting mat. We have our piece here we've prepped, and I have an extra one all ready to go for us, so we can put 2 on the block just like it belongs. And I'm going to go ahead and slice so that I just have a 1/4 inch seam allowance below the template. Because of course these go on the block before we put the blocks together, so we only need that 1/4 of an inch. Let's go ahead and slice that off. And let's slice the second one. We like to give ourselves that extra space, that whole 1/2 inch, because sometimes the freezer paper starch method will give you a small distortion with the bottom portion and make your piece just slightly smaller than you expect it to as you press. This is ensuring that our template really is giving us a complete shape, the whole shape. So you can see we're all turned over. Freezer paper is still in there. Our seam allowance is done. And we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the base. Let's bring those in and take a look at how they fit on the block. So here is our 10.5 by 8.5 inch block. Our arcs are ready to go. And we're going to peel the freezer paper out. So I just lift up the edge, pop the freezer paper out, kind of pop down that edge just like that. Let's do that with the second piece. That one came out nice and smooth. And then we're going to go ahead and take the piece and just line it up so it is centered on the top of the block. You can see that because we've trimmed to exactly 1/4 inch, we are landing right in the zone, exactly where we need to fit, point to point all the way through. We're going to do the same thing on the bottom and line up right to the edge of the block. And once again, we have done our job. We are point here and point here. Perfect. I like to pin into place. And as long as my pins are nice and visible, that makes me happy. I prefer silk pins. They are a little bit thinner, usually a 22 gauge, which means that they slide through the denser batiks that I really like to work with a little bit more easily. And I'm just going to put my pins all the way around the arc just like that. I'm going to turn my block so that I can pin the other side. You will notice that your bicycle fabrics on the heavy metal fabrics used for Gear Up in its first iteration are a little bit directional, and I don't worry about it too much because some of the bikes are a little upside down and right side up right next to each other. So if you want to do a little fussy cutting and make sure you get the bicycle of your choice landing upright, that's great. And if you don't want to focus on it too much, don't worry about it. Your pieces are going to line up beautifully and you're going to have great looking blocks because the directionality isn't too strong, upside down, right side up kind of concept. So here's our block ready to applique using my freezer paper starch method, where we have our templates oversized as we put them on the first time, trimmed down to size as we add them to the block, and you can see they fit into place beautifully. The same method works for your alternate block, which is going to have those templates landing on the outside edges. And let's take a look at both of those blocks in the quilt itself so you can see what the finished effect is going to look like. So here is the block we were just working on. You can see how we've landed with the point right in the corner, point right in the corner. The alternate block, there we are, is going to have those arcs on the side of the block. And what that gives you overall when you look at the quilt is that appearance of the wheel in the quilt, so that we get that idea of a bicycle wheel when those blocks come together. I hope that you enjoy making Gear Up. Have super fun with your project, and don't forget, stitch happy.